morning. How's everybody doing? How great is it to be back in New York City after 2 years? Climate Week, right? I don't know. The buzz around New York, I live around here, has been phenomenal this week. It really feels like the city is back. So thanks to anybody who came from out of town. Today's panel is today's carbon capture and storage, practical, scalable, and commercial. So I'm just going to take a minute or two to set the table. I've noticed two themes around Climate Week this year. The first is the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act. This is a game changer, in my opinion. I've been in the sustainability and ESG space since 2008. We've heard about these nascent technologies, CCS being one of them, sustainable aviation fuel, hydrogen, direct air capture. They've always been environmentally viable options in the fight against climate change. They've just always had this hurdle around the economics. And so I think what this act has done is it's a strong signal, and we'll get to this later, from a policy perspective that the US is taking this very seriously. And now it's time for the money managers, the bankers in this city and other cities around the world to deploy the capital, and it's up to the companies to adopt the technologies. The second theme that I've heard over the last couple of days is around trust. Trust in the viability of the technologies to remove carbon emissions or scale down carbon emissions. The trust among the verifiers to make sure that that is actually happening and delivering consistent, comparable data to the market. Trust among investors on the data that they're seeing from companies, and the trust from companies in the sincerity and the ambition around their goals. And I think this panel is going to take a great opportunity to talk about both of those two themes and go a little bit deeper today. So I'd like to take a second and have our panelists introduce themselves. Quickly, John, please introduce yourself to the room.
Yeah, you bet. Thanks, Lee. My name's John Pope. I was a scientist and professor back in 1997, 1998, focused on rechargeable batteries and the technologies behind them. I became an entrepreneur, a technical entrepreneur the next year, and focused again on sustainability businesses, batteries, fuel cells, reclaimed building materials, things like that. When 9/11 happened, I reluctantly stepped in front of one of our companies that we had that was an oil field service company and became an expert in subsurface chemical and physical processes. That company developed a sensor that allowed us to look at natural gas deep in the ground. Didn't realize it at the time, but the sensor also allowed us to look at CO2 in the ground. And so after a long path of years of building that company and understanding along the way how CO2 moves through rocks, we learned how to put CO2 back into one of the primary places that it's come from, which is coal seams. And so for the last 6 years or so, we've been building a company to not just support others doing that, but to actually lead the charge in getting that done. And we just began to commercialize this new way of doing carbon capture and sequestration over this last year.
Great, thanks, John. Mark, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hey, good morning, everyone, and thank you for having us today. And Lee, thanks for moderating. My name is Mark McDivitt. I'm the Chief Operating Officer of a global software company called Context Labs. And the theme we're talking about today is this idea of trust. We enable trust in data leveraging blockchain, AI, and machine learning. Prior to Context Labs, I was the global head of ESG for State Street. We were focusing on trying to tackle that central issue around trust in data, looking at those global custody portfolios, and looking at these data providers to drill into that, thusly the pivot to Context Labs around trying to get the trust in that data. And I also have a background in trading of environmental attributes.
Great, thanks, Mark. Ellen?
Hi, great to be here today. It's my first Climate Week. I'm an attorney, a project finance attorney with Baker Botts, which is a global law firm with a particular emphasis on energy. And what I'm going to be talking about today is 45Q, and in particular the opportunities presented by the IRA, as Lee mentioned. And at Baker Botts, we are representing a number of clients in various industries. And, since the IRA, there's been a lot more interest in pivoting and creating carbon capture with respect to their, existing emitters, and also building whole new factories that would, from the get-go have carbon capture integrated. So I think that, there is a lot more interest, in the last couple of weeks that I can see. And I hope, enjoy the conference.
Thank you, Alan. Last but not least, Bob.
Thanks, Lee. My name is Bob Van Heuvelen. I'm a lawyer in Washington, D.C. I had the climate and sustainability practice at a bipartisan lobbying firm, the Vogel Group. Among our clients is Carbon GeoCapture, and Dr. John Pope is one of our star clients. I had the pleasure and privilege of working with Senator Ed Muskie in the 70s, helping to write the Clean Air, Clean Water Act. I then had the joy of going to the Department of Justice with a number of folks in the audience to head the environmental enforcement section, which prosecutes federal law violations across all 94 U.S. attorneys' offices. And then I ended my federal career in enforcement as head of EPA Civil Enforcement Program. My last 10 years in the government, I ended up as a chief of staff for United States Senator Kent Conrad. In the last 15 years, I've been running a practice of sustainability as well as energy and environment, a number of other issues as well in Washington. Our middle name, first name, last name is advocacy, and we're here because we really, really care about this issue. So thank you, Lee.
Great, thank you. So just a quick informal poll. Who here feels like they have a really good grasp of what CCS is? Okay, so 20%. Who here wants to learn more about what CCS is? Oh, see? All right, great. So who's here for another reason other than to learn about it? Okay, good. So we thought it would be a good idea to maybe level set and talk about what CCS is and maybe what the difference is between CCUS. There's a lot of acronyms in this space. We've run out of 3-letter acronyms, so we've moved on to 4-letter acronyms. But I was going to hand it over to John now just to quickly talk about CCS and get everybody on the same page about this game-changing technology in the fight against climate change. John?
Yeah, you bet. So CCS stands for carbon capture and sequestration. By the way, the terms in this industry have evolved, and they continue to evolve pretty much every month. So it changes, and what people mean by these acronyms can change, can differ based on their background. But CCS is carbon capture and sequestration. CCUS adds in the possibility of utilizing the carbon to do something. And so sequestration can mean many things. It can mean putting the carbon dioxide in the ground. It can mean, CCUS can mean, mineralizing it and using it in cement. It can mean, CCS can mean mineralizing it and making big piles of it. One thing that a lot of people don't grasp is the scale of the problem that we're dealing with here. Giga means billion, and for some reason this industry uses giga instead of billion. But we need the best estimates by people who spend a lot of time on this are that we need to be sequestering 10 to 20 gigatons, billion tons of CO2 somewhere. We have to get it out of the carbon cycle, and we need to be doing that every year, starting like 3 years ago. Last year, the year before, we did about 30 million tons. We're nowhere. And many of the solutions that people talk about for CCS and CCUS are like teaspoons in an ocean. They have no way to approach the scale of the problem. Back in 2013, IPCC released a report that talked about CCS and about this problem. It was watered down for various reasons, but if you read between the lines, you could see that the only place that has the scale that's necessary to meet this 10 to 20 gigatons a year problem is frankly putting it back in the ground where most of it came from. And so geologic sequestration means that you take something and sequester it, you put it away, right, from us. So geologic sequestration is really the only place so far that we've been able to identify where we can put the CO2 and it won't have an adverse effect on the rest of the planet because it's still in the carbon cycle. So, so this is a challenge. One of the interesting things about it is that we can talk about stopping emissions, right? And we have two problems with that. The first is that it's too late. We've already emitted more carbon. Even if we started winding down emissions now, it would take enough time that we would be in what's called the overshoot before we could finish that. There would be more CO2 in the atmosphere that would sustain our civilization as it is. And, and as a result, it's too late to just stop emissions. However, that 10 to 20 gigatons a year does require that we do minimize emissions. If we don't minimize emissions, that number gets a lot bigger really fast. And so by minimizing emissions and by shifting to low carbon sources of power and better ways of doing things, we can minimize the problem that we have, but the problem is still huge. 10 to 20 billion tons of CO2 have to go somewhere, and we have to figure out how. That's the first problem. The second problem is that a lot of our industries, a lot of the things that we use in our world are things that we cannot reduce the emissions from down to zero. If you want cement to be in your future, we have to find a way to take the emissions that are inevitable from cement production and put them someplace so that they don't affect the planet. Same thing for steel, same thing for lots of things you see on this screen. And so as a result of that, we need this thing called CCS to help us now, to buy us time, right? And so that we can reduce the emissions down to a level that's more sustainable. And we need it long term in order to take care of the emissions that we cannot abate any other way. Right? So that's the situation that we're in. And people have looked at CCS as a way to, for example, sustain oil and gas industries or sustain other dirty industries and stuff like this. And it's gotten a bad name in some areas because of that. And I'll tell you flat out, that's nice. You can talk about that, but the house is on fire. We're not going to argue about where the water comes from. It's too late for that. We've got to do CCS. There is no other option. There's just no other option. And and so to the extent that people want to argue about what should have happened, and who benefited from that, we should do that later. Right now, what we should be doing is we should be getting rid of this carbon dioxide so that we have plenty of time to talk about that. So what this panel is going to be talking about today is what does it take for us to really make CCS reality? How do we get it out into the world in a practical way? How do we get it scaled up in a way that can address this problem? So.
Great, thanks, John. We'll dig into all those issues first, but let's talk first about the policy. So, Bob, is CCS a partisan issue? Does it have broad support across the Democratic landscape and the Republican landscape? And we're in a time where Democrats are controlling, the Senate and the executive chamber. What happens if that dynamic changes over the next couple of years?
It would be shocking to everybody in the audience that I would suggest this, but almost everything in Washington today is highly partisan. The bright light on that horizon, perhaps the possible exception, is CCS. We've had great progress, as witnessed by the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act, to be able to do something about that. That's the most significant change in climate policy really since the enactment of the first Clean Air Act in 1965. That said, that bill, that law passed the Congress with exactly zero Republican support. Go back a little bit, there was a bipartisan bill called the Infrastructure Bill, which was labeled bipartisan. That got 13 Republicans out of 198 in the House to support, 19 Republican senators out of 50 to support. The notion that, in fact, supporting this is clearly and easily a bipartisan issue is absolutely not clear. The notion that we have a challenge on our hands going forward is absolutely clear. I was at an event last night with a high-ranking member of leadership in the House of Representatives. The notion that you all have read in the paper that's almost certain that the House will flip is actually not empirically proven right now. In fact, it's a 50-50 shot that the Democrats will hold the House. Assuming that's not the case, so assuming the Republicans do become the majority party in the House, there is work to be done. We do have support. There are a number of bills on CCS that have been supported, introduced by Republicans, whether that's legitimate, whether that's covering their rear end, whether that's in fact a legitimate policy interest will remain to be seen. That's where we come in, that's where you all come in, and that's with respect to advocacy, and we need to put our shoulders to the wheel. I would invite each of you to consider how we can do that. That's what the firm that I work with, that's what the talented people who work with me in the audience are doing, and that's what we've got to do. It's a challenge. It's not a foregone conclusion either way. When I first started working on the environment in 1975, there were significant Republican support across the board for the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, for the Safe Drinking Water Act. That's not the case right now, and we've got a problem.
Thanks, Bob. So we've talked about technology. I like to look at things through the lens of technology, policy, and finance. So Ellen, describe the new supporting role that investors could look to advance the decarbonization now at play given the IRA.
Sure. I don't know how many of you understand what 45Q looked like before IRA and post-IRA. Maybe I'll just quickly touch on it. So it's a tax credit, and in general, it's available to people that own the carbon capture equipment. Most of the time, the developer doesn't necessarily have the tax appetite to utilize the tax credit, and so they would typically go to a bank or an insurance company that has a long-term appetite, has tax liability for long term. And that was the role that big investors would play after the 2018 amendments to the 45Q. 45Q started out, it wasn't working very well. In 2018, under Trump, it actually got amended significantly to provide for a 12-year credit term. It's a production tax credit, so depending on how many metric tons of carbon you permanently sequester, you got, under that earlier regime, a certain dollar per credit, depending on whether it was permanent sequestration or EOR or commercial use. Those numbers were welcomed at that point, but they also were not really enough to get people to significantly invest in this space. There was also some earlier dates by which you had to commence construction. That was also a problem earlier because it took the IRS a very long time to enact regulations, which they did in the beginning of 2020. And there was also a threshold which required that if you're going to take advantage of the tax credit regime, you had to have a certain a number of metric tons that you would capture every year of the 12 years in order to take advantage of the credit for that particular year. And those were very high thresholds, and it eliminated the possibility of carbon capture on smaller emitters. And so what the IRA has done is addressed a number of these problems in very creative ways. First of all, it increased the credit values for pure sequestration, so in a class 6 well or certain other permanent sequestration, as opposed to EOR or utilization. You have an $85 per metric ton credit. It's unlimited for the full 12-year credit period. There's a higher number for direct air capture. That's $180 per metric ton, which is a lot higher than the other credit. But direct air capture, I think, is a bit more expensive and really needs that support. The other significant, one of the other significant changes is it reduced the thresholds, and to very little, and therefore, this is sort of relevant to Lee's question as to how new players can kind of come into this space. by lowering the thresholds, you are now allowing carbon capture for smaller industries, and it's also spawned the beginning of another industry, which is basically the folks that are going to connect to these capture facilities and then bring all of the captured carbon into a hub where they've invested in a sequestration hub. And so before, you could never justify putting the capture equipment on a smaller project or a small emitter. Now you can. The dates by which you need to commence construction have been pushed out to 2033. And then most importantly, instead of only making the credits available to the tax investors who understand tax partnerships and who feel comfortable owning these assets, the IRS, in sort of a game-changing move, has now allowed for credits to be sold to third parties who have tax liability and who want to do, who want to make an investment, because they could agree to purchase that credit for, as generated or in advance and pay a lump sum. And the specifics on this, have yet to be set out in detail by the IRS, but the framework is pretty sweeping, and it opens up the possibility for any number of corporations that pay taxes in the United States to play a role by purchasing credits that are generated by CCS equipment owners. And there's also another provision which, given the newness of carbon capture and maybe the reluctance of some investors or lenders or even tech companies to participate, the IRS is going to allow for a direct pay. So if you don't have the tax liability, you can, for the first 5 years of a project's operating life, a CCS project, the government will monetize those tax credits for you. And there's also a role for tax exempts who, if they happen to own this equipment, actually get direct pay for the full 12 years, which puts tax exempt entities such as pension funds or unions or university endowments or other not-for-profits in a very interesting role that they've never been able to play in connection with tax credit regimes generally and carbon capture in particular.
So it sounds like a lot of barriers have been moved out of the way, which is very, very exciting.
I don't think we're quite there though, if I can weigh in. Actually,
Sure.
before I go, on DAC, in case you don't know, DAC is direct air capture. This is a three-letter acronym that refers to pulling CO2 directly from the air, it's around us right now at 400 parts per million. And people really like direct air capture because we get to pull it from the pool, from the lake that we're all putting our sewage into. And so we don't have to identify one particular stream of sewage that we're protecting. We get to pull it out from. So it's apolitical. And so direct air capture is getting a lot of resource right now and a lot of attention, because if you start pulling it from the steel sewage stream or the coal-fired power plant sewage stream or whatever, you're accused of protecting those interests, right? And that becomes much more difficult to do practically. But even if you look at direct air capture, the best numbers right now are that it's $1,000 a ton currently. And so, having $120, $150 a ton tax credit really doesn't do much. Same thing for, for conventional CCS. The best numbers right now are $100, $120 a ton for post-combustion, like a coal-fired power plant or a cement plant. So $85 a ton, you're still out of. Sorry, say again?
I think his mic is going on and off.
Just repeat the numbers around
Yeah, so for
CCS.
For CCS, best numbers right now are $100, $120 a ton. So $85 a ton for the tax credit still leaves us underwater. But what we're seeing here is a realization by our society that CCS has to be incented, and we're slowly bringing up the incentives that we're putting in place and trying to reduce these barriers that Lee just mentioned. And the question is whether it's enough. But we have to remember what we're playing with here, right? I mean, the experiment that we're playing, the gamble we're taking is that it's going to be enough, but we don't know. And are we moving fast enough? We don't know. The scientists say no, right? And so that's the risk that we're taking with this approach that we're using.
So Mark, I want to talk about carbon markets,
Yeah.
right? Because John just kind of threw out some numbers on the price of carbon, and I think that's a great transition into how are these carbon markets developing and whether or not CCS offsets are attractive to carbon offset buyers.
Yeah, so you guys appreciate the carbon markets, particularly the voluntary carbon markets, have doubled over the past 12 to 24 months. It was $1 billion market last year. It's a $2 billion market this year. And I think it's critical as a solution to addressing the climate crisis. The work that John's doing in capturing sequestration of carbon and the ability to fund those projects really drives a integral part in being able to fund the work that you're doing in the generation of these credits. So in short, I'm a huge advocate of the carbon markets and how they're going to play a key role in this climate crisis.
Now, because you waited so patiently for everybody to talk, I'm going to give you two
Yeah.
questions in a row. What is Context Labs? How are they relevant as to what's happening in the carbon markets and what's happening at geocarbon capture?
Yeah, sure. So one of the biggest issues we talked about, and Lee kicked off the topic today, is this word called trust. How do we trust the data? How do we trust these markets? You may have seen a large NGO about a year ago issued a whole slew of credits to JP Morgan, BlackRock, and Disney. And JP Morgan, BlackRock, and Disney stood up and said, hey, we're carbon neutral. Look at what we've done. We purchased these great carbon credits. Problem is they had to redact all those credits because there wasn't additionality. Well, let me see a show of hands who knows the word additionality, right? So additionality, was it, if in the absence of these carbon markets, did they actually make an impact? Unfortunately, the credits that were purchased by these three entities came from something called RED, reduced emissions from deforestation and degradation. And the idea being is, look, we're not going to tear down the forest. Because we're not tearing down the forest, you can generate a credit. Problem was with these credits that were issued, those forests were always being preserved into perpetuity. Pie on the face of JP Morgan, BlackRock, and Disney. Hang on, we're trying to do the right thing, but how do we trust these markets? Gets back to that word trust. We want to, as Context Labs, come in and help improve the integrity of these markets. And it goes down to the ability to look at the data, quantify empirical data to say, in fact, this is a ton of carbon that has been sequestered. Let's look at the files, let's look at the public files that are out there and identify exactly the history. Now, if actually someone did their homework, they would realize that these forests were already captured into perpetuity. So we're trying to capture all sorts of disparate data and provide that level of integrity to these markets. So another example is the midstream oil and gas companies is an example. Everyone's raising their hand to transition to net zero. How do they prove it? How do they prove what they're doing? Historically, what's been happening is there's a guy with a clipboard. He walks out to the midstream pipe and he says, hang on, there's methane leaking from that pipe. Let's take down our data and then go back and report on that data. How do you trust the guy with the clipboard? I'm not saying he's doing anything wrong, but let's take his inputs. But let's also take satellite imagery. Let's put a sensor right next to the well. And let's get third-party attestation from a Deloitte or a KPMG as an example. Take all that data, deconstruct it, reconstruct it, shrink wrap it, and drop it on blockchain. Now, we'll touch on blockchain a little later, and this misnomer I think this week is blockchain is this magic wand. Problem is, you've heard of the idea of garbage in, garbage out. We're trying to fix the bit in the beginning, no garbage in. So the idea being is let's take all this disparate data, deconstruct it, reconstruct it, shrink wrap it, and drop it on a blockchain. The end result is something called the provenance and veracity of the data can in fact be trusted. And going back to that midstream oil and gas company, they can then go to the regulators and say, this in fact is exactly what's going on. They can get a lower cost of capital with that presentation. And investors are going to say, I can actually think that this holding as it relates to the externalities of that portfolio vis-a-vis their competition gives me that much level of comfort. So Context Labs is playing that role in helping improve the integrity of the data that's going into these projects.
And Lee, might I interrupt? As a former head of EPA's enforcement program, the integrity with which he develops that data and his folks do becomes critical, not just to the trading scheme, but to the fundamental notion that the public is being protected, to the point that the tax credits which are now in place will actually mean something. So it's huge. It's really essential, and it's a big missing part of the market. So congratulations.
And one thing I'm really excited about is one takeaway, guys, as we leave today. The big challenge with every single probably corporate in this audience is how do we arrive at the singular price of carbon? What's fair value for a ton of carbon dioxide? What's the fair value for a megawatt hour of power, right? The carbon markets, the global carbon markets are going to get us there. Think about the global foreign exchange markets. The bias, I've been in FX for my whole life, so that's my background. Got into the trading markets back in 2005. I said, hang on, the spreads between dollar, yen, and the euro are like this. The spread between a carbon credit is probably like this, but hang on, there's a nice co-benefit to that called improving the environment. Where am I going with this conversation?
Trust.
No, the point is, the markets are going to get us to a single price on carbon. If we can put a single price on carbon, we can price the externalities of portfolios,
that's right.
And that's going to make better informed decisions. So a big shout out to those carbon markets. A huge takeaway is trying to identify a singular price on carbon that everyone agrees on globally. So stay tuned on that front.
Mark, are you talking about trying to take the carbon credits from this beauty pageant kind of place it is right now to a place where it's fungible?
Spot on.
Where one credit is the same as the next credit, even
right.
if different people manage it?
Right, now, but the challenge with that, and what I definitely want to draw on too, is a ton of carbon is a ton of carbon is a ton of carbon. We can quantify that accordingly. What the biggest challenge is going to be the S factor into these projects. Let's try to quantify the S factor of the projects that John is working on and others. Can we actually say, okay, we've sequestered a ton of carbon in these projects, but actually we've also generated a whole slew of new jobs. We've taken a community that were coal miners, we've completely repurposed those employees. We've improved the health and well-being of those communities. And if we can quantify that through statistics like how many new jobs have we created? Are the depression rates in those communities improved? Adding that S factor to a carbon credit, that's going to also help with the premium of those credits. So,
and to that point, right?
Yeah.
The IRA, and this is for Bob or Ellen. There are kickers in the incentives as it relates to a just transition, which is another thing that we're hearing.
The $85, and this is sort of for 45Q, but for every single credit that basically is provided for now in the tax code with respect to clean energy, it has sort of a two-tier approach. There's a nominal number, base number, and that is multiplied by 5 to get what is the 85 or the 30% for the solar, or, for the ITC. But in order to get to that 5 times, you have to satisfy prevailing wage and apprenticeship requirements, which they need to put those rules into place, and there is a little bit of a grace period if you begin your project before a period of time lapses after they put those rules into place. But there's also kickers for locating your project in what's called an energy community, which is like a low-income community or a community that had a coal plant or a coal mine that had been closed since I think 1999, and there's also kickers for solar projects that are located in certain low-income communities. But there are other provisions in the IRA that will kick in the future for net zero power generation and also clean hydrogen production. The clean hydrogen production actually kicks in now. And for those credits, there is a measurement of emissions, a carbon intensity of what their project is all about. And the people that I'm working with now are looking at a particular provision in the congressional record that actually didn't make it into the statute that talked about how you could possibly reduce your emissions rate by purchasing these attributes that are verified by folks like Bob.
Mark. Context Labs.
Bob, sorry.
And what about the S factor, though? So really cool. Tell me about the kicker. How do you actually quantify the S factor of those credits? I mean, that's what I'm really excited about.
That's a good question. That is going to be a very, very important question. If you go and buy, offsets for, and the offsets are interesting because you don't actually have to buy the commodity, you just buy the offset, right? So you're creating two markets really, or continuing a market for power or for natural gas, but then you have an attribute that can be traded, and the utilization of it is to lower carbon footprints for corporate America, or the world or countries or whoever has pledged to reduce emissions generally, but also to create an opportunity to get tax credits in the United States that they wouldn't have otherwise been able to get. I mean, we still see whether the regs are going to provide for this, but there's in like the clean hydrogen 45V, there's significant step ups from like 0 to 60 cents all the way up to $3, depending on your carbon intensity. So,
Bob, what can be, so we're talking about, all these local markets, federal markets, carbon markets, technology. What more can be done at the federal level to promote this particular technology and carbon capture deployment?
Very good question. But before I go to that, let me add, with respect to the integrity of the trading and carbon measurement, in 2026, the European Union is going to have very strict guidelines as to what can be imported. It's got to be carbon neutral, as I understand. And so to the extent that it's not just about entities getting money for purposes of carbon capture, it's also about your ability to trade worldwide. And even if the United States is going to drag its feet, the world is not. And so I think it becomes really important. To your question, though, one, we need a price on carbon. Two, we need to absolutely clarify, in spite of what the Supreme Court just said about EPA's ability to control and regulate carbon, we have to absolutely have a new regulatory scheme authorized by the Congress, which will meet the Supreme Court's ridiculous test in my mind. Three, we've got to fix 45Q. It's not just, as John says, it may not be adequate given the cost of capture, given the cost of sequestration, but it also, there's a disparity between what the tax code will provide for disposal relative to utilization. Another point, at EPA, there are years and years and years of delay for people seeking permits with respect to, what are they, Chapter 6?
Class 6 wells.
Class 6 wells.
oh yeah.
Years. And that's not because they like dragging their feet. It's not because they're anti-anything. It's because they don't have the manpower, person power, pardon me. But the reality is, and having been at EPA, having worked there when, in fact, it was thinly staffed, and it's even more thinly staffed now, we need more money there. There are probably 8 other things that I'm forgetting, but yes, there's a lot to be done. We could up those numbers in 45Q. And we actually really have immediately, regardless of whether or not the Congress flips or not, we have the job now of protecting what's put in place. And that is, just because it's there, just because it was passed, just because it was signed into law, doesn't mean it's there forever. It doesn't even mean it's there for a year. So we've got an advocacy element that is very, very critical.
Thank you. So Ellen touched a little bit on the barriers that have been eliminated for financing, right? So John, as the expert in this technology, what are the other barriers to scale that we're faced with?
Yeah, I mean, the traditional way that we do CCS, the way we've been doing it for a while, which is well understood, is that we capture CO2 and we take it and purify it, which is expensive, and we compress it to a high pressure, which is expensive. When we say expensive, it's both cost but also energy, right? And every time we use energy, we make more carbon somewhere else to produce that energy. And so we then take that CO2, that pure CO2 stream, and we blow up a balloon deep in the ground. And what Bob's talking about on the permitting is related a lot to that balloon, because what we do is we go find domes on 10,000 feet in the ground where the rock above the balloon will hold it, right? Because there's no skin of the balloon, we're just using the rock. And so we go find these domes and we blow up balloons underneath them of high pressure gas, and then the idea then is that it's going to stay there for a long time. But we worry a lot about whether that's true. And what that worry looks like is that we do studies and studies and studies, and we talk with permitting bodies like the EPA, and we convince them that there's a good chance it's going to stay there. right? But that process of convincing ourselves as a society that it's going to stay there takes time. And this is part of why Class 6 permitting is so difficult for these balloons. And so that's, that technical barrier of, frankly, the risk profile of that, and also the fact that we can't have a mistake right now. It would be catastrophic to climate change and to CCS in general if we had one. Those reasons cause us to be super cautious, and when we're cautious, we're slow. And so that's probably the number one barrier to scale. The second barrier to scale for traditional CCS is that there's only so many of these places you can blow up a balloon. And a lot of times they're not close to the places where the CO2's coming out. And so you end up having to do things like, well, I want to put a pipeline through your backyard. Well, that's a long conversation, right?
Yeah.
John, can you define balloon?
Yeah, balloon. What I mean by balloon is that we would take CO2 and we'd put it down in the ground in a place where a dome of rock, shale, like an impermeable rock, like a shale, would hold it. And when I say balloon, what I mean is doesn't look like a balloon, of course, but it's a pocket of gas at high pressure that we've created in the ground. But it's a good way to think about it because it also highlights the risk. If you go down and prick a balloon, it's going to burst, right? If you have a fracture through the rock that you missed, or if you have an earthquake that changes something, or things like this, you can also, convince yourself that there's a risk of it coming out. That risk is probably not material, but it's also probably not zero.
Sure.
And and as a result, we need to be careful. And that risk is used, by people to say we shouldn't do it at all. Because if that happens, then we're just, then the CO2 is all going to come out, which makes no sense to me, because the risk is pretty small, and if it all comes back out, we're just back where we started.
Right.
So it's not like something awful has happened. In most cases, it's just that we had a problem on one of the balloons, and now we got to blow up some more.
So Ellen, we've heard about permitting as maybe being a last or another barrier that now has going to jump in the face of these projects coming on board. Can you just quickly touch on whether or not project developers have all the tools that they need and whether or not there are still impediments specifically around permitting?
Well, sure. So these are very large projects. They take a long time to develop, and they cost a lot of money. And the regulations that we hope will come from Treasury on some of the newer features in the IRA will be welcome. I think nobody is going to put billions of dollars to work until they are confident that they have dotted all their I's and crossed all their T's from with respect to the money that they're going to be expecting in terms of 45Q. So that's sort of general. It applies to a lot of other industries as well. But the carbon capture area, I think, is challenged by a couple of other things that the federal government hasn't really addressed. The idea of pore space is a state by state issue. Who owns it? Some of the states, it's not particularly clear. And so if you wanted to undertake a project and you don't even know who you're going to need to buy the property from and who might make a claim after the fact. So getting states to recognize this is an interest that needs to be the subject of clear rules and laws would be helpful. A number of states have sort of jumped in and actually moved to the forefront. I mean, Louisiana has a very clear set of rules. They also have taken the position, I think North Dakota as well, that after a certain amount of time after you finish injecting, I think 10 years, that the state basically takes over the stewardship of the sequestration project. So it relieves the developers, from long-term liability. And that is, I think, a state-by-state thing, but it might inhibit activity in states that don't have that kind of a support system. And then there's also the idea of the pipelines and the NIMBY. People don't want pore space being injected in under the land. They don't understand the risks. The same thing on the pipeline. the FERC had years ago said that FERC being the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, said that they had no jurisdiction to regulate carbon dioxide pipelines. I haven't heard that they've taken responsibility lately. But these are going to be large trunk lines. They're going to go interstate, and that is going to be an important piece of getting the vast numbers of metric tons in the ground that we're going to need. And so that could be a problem. And there's a couple of developers in the Midwest now that I think are trying to use eminent domain and whatnot to put their pipes in the ground, and we'll see how that works out.
So, Bob, our states, like we talked about this, we've talked about the federal level, right? But we talked about it before we got on stage, and if you could just keep remarks short, I have 3 more questions to get through in 10 minutes, so let's see if we can do it. Are states generally in favor of CCS?
It's across the board. There are 50 different states and several territories, but there are several states, for instance, North Dakota and Wyoming, that have primacy under the Safe Drinking Water Act, the UIC program, and they are very interested in moving forward. Other states like Louisiana and there are several others who've adopted the kind of statutory scheme where the state will take liability off of the operators. I think it's an evolving program. It's across, it varies across states. And if you overlay that, as John was suggesting, with where the coal reserves are, where the emitters are, you have a very interesting pastiche that presents why this is challenging as an individual state effort. That's why the national program is really important. So I think the short answer is it depends. There are some leaders and there's some promise there. Notably, when you have primacy under the UIC program, the Underground Injection Control Program, it doesn't mean you have lesser standards. It just means that the state then takes the resource burden of doing the permitting and the evaluation. As John knows well, working with the state of Wyoming, that's made it a lot easier as opposed to years and years and years of delay where, in fact, there are just no resources at EPA to handle this in the water program.
Got it. So, Mark, I just want to go back to trust. So we had a question in here from the audience, asking about how long it takes to verify and are there any shortcuts, which is one question I want you to answer, right? Okay. But sometimes when you take a shortcut, you might, have a little bit of a trust issue. Yeah. And there's this viral video going around with John Oliver poking holes around the global voluntary carbon markets. So how do you bring these things to market quickly? How do you maybe find a shortcut that's not going to, erode trust, but then how do you also develop credibility and transparency around these global carbon markets?
It's probably a 10-minute question, but that's good.
I said we had 10 minutes.
No, it's 10 minutes. Yeah, it's plenty.
3 questions.
All right, so first question was, how long does it take to verify a project? Right now, historically, it takes around 2 years to get a project from inception to reality. To answer, how do we speed that process up? And I don't like the word shortcut, respectfully.
Sure.
We at Context Labs, this is not it is a promotional, I suppose, but we use AI, machine learning, and blockchain to not only speed up the process, automate the process of data ingestion, of inputs around a project, such as what we're doing with carbon geocapture, but we also use blockchain to provide that level of integrity. And I'm going to just reiterate this, blockchain is not a magic wand. Garbage in, garbage out, we know those statements. We first have to understand the trust and transparency of the data that we're capturing. And so looking at that data and really providing a level of integrity to that data and then dropping on a ledger, I think will enhance the level of credibility. And as it relates to leveraging AI and machine learning, that'll accelerate the process to create these projects that we're working on with carbon geocapture faster to market. So hopefully that answers the question. So as an example, we're partnering where the great work that John's doing vis-a-vis carbon sequestration into a coal bed, leveraging water to keep the carbon sequestration happening to perpetuity. They've got a sensor next to that project called Raman Technologies. Now, correct me if I'm wrong on any aspect of this. We're taking that data. We're looking at that data real time. We're ingesting it into our tech stack called Immutably, and we're then dropping that on a ledger. That then is going to go through our whole verification process that we've just launched yesterday called ClearPath, Context Labs Environmental Attribute Registry, which then will ultimately generate a credit, which in our view will be able to say it's a higher level of integrity credit that ultimately will demand a premium in the market and bring that credit to market faster. Hopefully that answers the question.
And just let me jump in. John, I think you should jump in and talk about the technology you have, because we're talking about integrity of the data. You've got assurances in the systems you've developed in this company as well as previous companies about how to make sure that the stuff is where you've put it.
Yeah, no, I hear you. I don't want to step on your last
No,
question.
please.
Okay. Yeah, so we actually learned, as I said before, we learned how to, we saw how Mother Nature flowed CO2 through coal naturally, and it was different than how people were trying to put CO2 into coal when they were trying to sequester it. And so we saw an opportunity to sequester CO2 in coal in a way that would be sustainable. Being data people, because we had sensors all over the place, and these were sensors that showed us this stuff, we've ended up with a bunch of data and a bunch of data capability around this process. You know, and it's a process that actually we didn't realize it at the time, but in the end, we're able to use the coal to filter the CO2 out of the flue stream, really. So we don't have to clean it up before we put it down in the ground. We can clean it up some, we can clean it up none, and that saves a lot of money, which of course, as we said before, is energy, right? So it saves a lot of energy. And then when we put it in the ground, we can tell where it is. We can also do this at a small scale. So a lot of the problems with large project finance and the delays that happen there, these are avoided. Also, this is more shallow than the deeper traditional CCS, which we do as a side gig. But you know, this is more like 1,200 feet instead of 10,000 feet. And as a result, you know, it's a less compression cost, which is again is energy and carbon impact. But one of the best parts is that the coal is a sponge. Coal is actually a pretty cool material, despite how we've treated it. And it's a sponge. It's a nanoporous sponge that loves CO2, and it soaks the CO2 up naturally and holds it. It likes it. In fact, it'll choke if you give it too much. And so what that means is instead of blowing up a balloon underground, we're filling a sponge. And if you take a hammer and hit a balloon, everything comes out. If you take a hammer and hit a sponge, just a little bit comes out. So implicitly, inherently, it has a much different safety profile, which helps a lot when it comes to Class 2, Class 6 permitting aspects. But to come back to what Bob was mentioning, that's just kind of the background on the approach. I guess one more thing I should say is, or maybe two more things I should say about it, is that it's available at scale. The industry that has tried to make natural gas from coals, actually, they've drilled 100,000 wells worldwide. A couple 100,000 wells of this takes care of gigatons of CO2. So it's well within our capabilities as a society to do this. And it's also because of the fact that the coal does a lot of the work on filtering out the CO2, it's much cheaper. It's in the $20, $30, $40 per ton range versus $100, $120 a ton range. And again, when we talk about money, we're talking about carbon impact. We're talking about energy. So this is available to us in a way that, and it's important to us in a way that the traditional CCS is not. So then to come to your question though, because we came into this from a sensing standpoint and watching what was happening subsurface, we end up in a place where we have a lot of inputs. And so one of the things that we're doing is working with Context Labs to take those inputs and make them transparent so that people can look at it themselves and they can decide whether they trust it themselves.
I think we set a world record for most references to coal in a sustainability conference.
Tell you what.
That's good for us.
I just
Ellen,
one
please.
follow-up. Under 45Q, the way it was originally drafted, there were issues, and people probably overclaimed. And in subsequent iterations and regulations, there is now a very rigorous measurement that's required in order to be able to claim the credit. And there's also a concept of recapture, which penalizes, which looks back for 3 years, and it's a complicated formula. But if there is leakage from the sequestrated, the pore space up, or in any other cavern or seam, there is a you have to unwind the credits and basically pay back the IRS what you got. There's a 3-year look back, and so that is together with all the monitoring that's required the careful measurement, independent verification in some cases is required, and this threat of recapture, from the federal perspective, I think they've really beefed up the ways to enforce compliance and make sure that people aren't claiming the credits when they're not supposed to.
So Mark, I think you want to lead
Yeah,
on
just real
that
quick,
too,
I
right?
didn't finish your probably 5-minute question to me. I had one last bit you wanted.
Yeah, no problem.
So how many, let me see a show of hands, how many saw the John Oliver article or what Lee was referring to? So John Oliver, hilarious guy, got a lot of time for his presentation. He went off on the carbon markets recently and basically, I would argue, discredited them. And I would say, look, big shout out to John Oliver for raising the profile of the carbon markets. I would suggest his staff gave a half-baked effort in really quantifying exactly what was going on. So one of the issues I think with the carbon markets, we don't do a good enough job of quantifying the actual positive impact to society with these projects. I'll just reemphasize, yes, we're getting closer to properly quantifying a ton of carbon, the E of ESG, but let's get really deep into the S of ESG. Let's go to those folks in Africa who purchased African cook stoves under the gold standard verification and ask them, did that actually impact your world? Well, we've empowered women, new jobs. We've improved the health and well-being of those families with these new African cook stoves. John Oliver forgot to bring all that stuff up. So I just give a shout out to, thank you, John, for raising the profile of the carbon markets, but kind of bad on you, John. You didn't really do your homework. The carbon markets have a massive opportunity to impact the world. First of all, putting a proper price on carbon, a singular price on carbon where global asset managers and asset owners can properly price their portfolios, and we can actually accelerate this whole transition to net zero.
So policy, finance, global markets, technology, all part of the solution to bringing this particular solution to the forefront. I think that's a great place to end. Thank you very much.
Thank you.